Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Propmodo webinar. As always, I will be your host. My name is Franco. I am the co-founder and editor of Propmodo, and this will be our last webinar for the year. I'm excited about that. Hopefully, it's our best. Today, we will be talking about the business case for investing in EV charging under a Trump administration. Obviously, there is a lot of question marks about what Trump administration will do, and a big piece of that is what's going to happen with, electric vehicle infrastructure, electric vehicle incentives. We'll be going over all of that. We'll also just be talking a little bit about, EV charging, just, the kind of nuts and bolts of the ROI on it and, some of the best practices and how to think about all of that. So this is a live recording. Anything can happen. I have a child home sick, so if someone comes running in the background, please forgive me. That time of the year. And we also will not be saving time at the end for questions because we want you guys to add some questions to the chat or the Q&A whenever they come up, and we will answer them, as we get them. I see you have some really great backgrounds. I see a lot of solar companies, energy companies, property companies. So please lob us some tough ones and maybe some easy ones too, and we'll do our best to answer them as they come. So there's obviously a lot to get into and a lot of kind of specifics about EV charging. I think a lot of times it is glossed over as something very simple. You add EV chargers to a property, no brainer, right? But when you get into the specifics of it, and especially when you're trying to make a business case for it, if you're a property, I think sometimes it gets a little muddy. And I think a lot of the property industry is kind of trying to see its way through that right now to understand the best path forward. So without further ado, I will intro our speakers. First, we have Josh Cohen. He's head of policy at SWTCH. That's an EV charging provider. Hi, Josh.
Hello, good to see you.
Yeah, thanks for joining. And next, we have Amanda Janaski. She's senior manager at Baltimore Gas and Electric. Hi, Amanda. Thanks for joining.
Hey, everybody. Looking forward to the conversation today.
Yeah, likewise. And last, we have Paul Yildiz. He is general manager of CAP EV Group. That's also a turnkey EV charging service provider. Hi, Paul.
Hey, Franco.
So I got the name right. I've been practicing all morning.
Perfect.
Great. Well, let's just get into it. I mean, Trump was a surprise for me when he won. I'm sure as a lot of other people were surprised as well. And I think, in this kind of time in between his election win and his inauguration, which is coming up very shortly, people are trying to scramble and figure out, what kind of policy changes are coming down the pike, how things are going to change. I think a big piece of this has to do with the EV market itself. EVs have been subsidized generally by the federal government and by a lot of states as well. And so maybe before we get into charging specifically, we can just chat a little bit about the size of the EV market, right? Because I think they go hand in hand. If we see the EVs leveling off, obviously there's not as much of a need for more charging, but if it continues to grow, which I think it has shown, then we'll certainly need more infrastructure for that. Josh, I'll start with you. What's your kind of thoughts on the future growth of just EV, electric vehicles under this new administration in the next 4 years?
Sure. I think anytime there's a new administration coming, it creates some uncertainty. And then particularly given some of the headlines and statements that candidate Trump and President-elect Trump have made, it certainly adds uncertainty as to what is this new administration going to mean for a range of things, including electric vehicles. And I think it's really valuable to focus on the fundamentals of the market and the numbers and the data. And the data show that EVs are growing and continuing to grow, EV adoption, EV market share. And those fundamentals, in my opinion, are irreversible. EVs are a real thing. Millions of them have been sold in the United States. Just in the third quarter of 2024, almost 350,000 full battery electric EVs were sold, which is an 11% increase year over year from third quarter of last year. And so if you're only looking at the headlines, particularly for a newish technology like electric vehicles, there's a tendency for small changes to be overblown. Oh no, there's going to be an over-the-air upgrade needed for this brand of EV to address some issue, or this automaker is scaling down their projections, but this happens with incumbent automakers and gas vehicles. So again, focusing on the market fundamentals. The market fundamentals for EV adoption in the States continue to be really strong and growing. And as you pointed out, Franco, hand in hand with EVs is the need for charging and that business case. The federal government does have an important role in a number of respects that can help kind of steer the market as I see it. And I'm sure we'll get into that. But overall, the fundamentals of the market remain strong.
I couldn't agree more with Josh's statement in terms of EV adoption. It does continue to accelerate nationwide. I oversee our transportation electrification programs at Baltimore Gas and Electric, which is both a gas and electric utility. And we've done some recent analysis within our territory, which serves like Central Maryland within the state. We have about 100,000 electric vehicles within Maryland. 65,000 of those are actually in BGE's territory. And actually, in the last 12 months, we actually have seen nearly 30,000 new cars become registered that are electric vehicles. So I know there's a lot of conversation, a lot of headlines out there about potentially like the slower adoption of electric vehicles, but it's the complete opposite of what we're seeing in Maryland right now within our utility service territory.
Yeah, that's fascinating too, because I think colder weather, generally people think, oh, EVs don't really play well in cold snaps. I mean, you guys think it's cold out there in Maryland. I mean, do you see, would a particularly cold winter maybe deter some people, or you think it's just inevitable?
It's a great question. You see a lot of headlines too, especially when some of the states get real cold and they have some blizzards come through. At least what I can say from customer feedback within our territory and the customers we serve, we don't really get that cold here. We might have some cold days, but I don't really think that's going to be a deterrent, especially for customers that are interested and really understand the value and the benefits that an EV can drive for them.
Mm-hmm. Well, what about you? I know you guys are looking kind of all over the country, right? What are you seeing about kind of growth in EVs? And is it regional, or is it, in your opinion, do you think it's just the entire US is going to have growth in this category?
Yeah, I think just to build off of Josh's comment, the trends are continuing to show increased EVs on the road. So, I mean, obviously that's one metric of identifying EV chargers and their adoption. But another thing to consider is there's a lot of EV drivers that don't actually have the EV infrastructure even built out within their dwelling or their multi-unit residential building. So I think that, regardless of EV charging, EV charging is still going to be required, as there's still kind of this catch up that utility providers there's very difficulty working on rolling out the infrastructure in the back end to get the power to the specific locations, and enough to provide some transient chargers as an interim solution. But yeah, that's, the market is continuing to show that EVs are continuing to grow, and thus EV charging is required.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we have one of those people without electric EV charging infrastructure at their house here. Josh is joining us, I think, from a Walmart parking lot, right? Charging that car behind you. You have said that you don't have a charger at your house, right? Like, is that the top priority for you, right? Like, if you are going into a new property, would you like? Is this top of mind for you to live in a place that has an EV charger for your car?
So I'm an EV driver, and like you say, I live in a multifamily condominium building. And so, ironically, even though I work for a company that specializes in EV charging solutions at a range of multi-tenant properties, one of the quirks and challenges associated with that sector is that the culture, the governance, the people involved from one condo building or one apartment building to the next, it can vary, in their own interest and willingness and curiosity about EVs. So that's the irony. But to answer your question, Franco, for me, given my daily commute patterns, I'm fortunate to work remotely, and so I'm able to charge at public chargers, including some that BGE owns and operates just within a easy walk from my condo. It's not an issue for me, but I'm just one person with my own unique situation. I'd say more broadly, multifamily property residents, they're significantly underserved, and charging infrastructure remains the availability of charging infrastructure, the convenience remains a top issue, like a top need for most people who are either current EV drivers or they're thinking of getting an EV. And so addressing that, cracking that nut, as they say, for multifamily properties has been a challenge for the industry overall. And it's something that, as an industry and as a country, if we're going to achieve like really widespread EV adoption and do it in an equitable way where everyone will have convenient access to charging, the only way we're going to get there is if we do that for multifamily properties as well.
Yeah, which might need some incentivization. I see some questions coming in. I promise I will get to them. But first, I do really want to sink our teeth into what this policy changes might be, right? I think, if we're looking at what Trump's administration might slash, they've promised to slash a lot of things. What are some of the federal subsidies that might be in trouble here, and what might that mean for the future of EV charging? Paul, maybe I can go to you with this one real quick.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, when we first we get a request from a client and they say, oh, I want to add EV chargers, it's as broad as that, kind of narrowing it down. And obviously the second question after how many chargers can I put in is what are the available rebates? So it kind of goes hand in hand with EV charging adoption. So being able to, have federal and utility and state rebates to rely on in order to actually push out these steep EV charging targets is important. And it's actually it's very critical to being able to deliver a solution for a client, because obviously, especially for an older building where there's a lack of power availability, there is a requirement for a substation upgrade or a transformer in order to even add 4 transient chargers within the property. The rebate is really going to help. Being able to leverage and stack rebates is it's ultimately going to help, and that's kind of the only way that we're going to be able to incentivize and roll out EV chargers throughout multi-unit residential buildings or even residential or commercial properties.
Josh, how about you? What do you think about, obviously there, it's critical, right? Like Paul said, I think a lot of these projects would not have gone through without a stacking of a bunch of incentives, particularly if there's all these other, expenses of new panels and new, main lines and all of this stuff. So what do you think is maybe on the chopping block for the federal government with the new administration?
Sure. So I do want to emphasize that point about stackability, though, because if you think about, or the way I think about incentives, I think about them really in 3 buckets. One is the electric utility, which has a key role to play in a variety of ways when it comes to EV charging. One is the state government. Sometimes a city or county will have incentives and rebates. And then the third is the federal piece. So really, regardless of what happens at the federal level, there's other sources for incentives and support for EV charging. First point. But the second point is, fortunately, I think, though I am expecting changes at the federal level with the new administration and the new Congress, I do not expect it to be a wholesale 180-degree turn, a wholesale repeal of some of the incentives that are currently in place. And let me just briefly run down 4 key incentives. So in 2021, Congress enacted the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, otherwise known as the IIJA. And because we don't have enough acronyms, it's also called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or BIL. And then in 22, Congress enacted the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA. And so just as relates to this conversation around EV infrastructure in particular, so the bipartisan infrastructure law had two major programs that were really focused just on the infrastructure piece. One is NEVI, the National EV Infrastructure Formula Program, which is a little over $4 billion over 5 years. That money flows to the states, and it's based on highway formula funding. And that money, my expectation is, will continue through 2026, which is its natural end anyway. Another incentive is the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure, or CFI, grant program. That's also in the bipartisan infrastructure law. That's $2.5 billion, also over 5 years, just like it says, for charging and alternative fueling infrastructure. And so we can get into some of the nuances of that, but those programs and those funds were established by law. And so I expect those to continue through their natural end in 2026. If you go to the Inflation Reduction Act, that includes two tax credits that are really critical for this industry. One is the EV tax credit, or what's commonly called the EV tax credit, which is Section 30D for policy nerds. And that's up to $7,500 for certain eligible electric vehicles. There's also the 30C infrastructure tax credit. And that can be up to $100,000 or up to 30% of the cost per unit, per piece of property. And so for fast charging, that's a significant incentive. So both of those tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act were extended until the end of 2032, because when Congress enacted it, it wanted to provide market predictability. So that's the state of play kind of going into this next administration. What I expect next year is, number one, Congress is going to revisit tax policy overall, which it was going to do regardless of who won the election, because a number of tax credits that were adopted even before the Inflation Reduction Act are expiring. So basically, I think every tax credit will at least be looked at. The second point is I'm expecting the EV tax credit to go away or be scaled back significantly in some way. I think candidate Trump, his advisor, Elon Musk, have both talked about it. I've been in some conversations with congressional offices and the Republican side, and it's just top of mind for people that I talk to, as well as colleagues around the industry. So I think it's likely to expect that the EV tax credit will be repealed. The 30C tax credit, which is the infrastructure tax credit that's most relevant to this conversation, every tax credit is at risk, but I'm not hearing any real opposition to it. It's not even on a lot of people's radar. I think one of its saving graces may be that, unlike the EV tax credit that only applies to EVs and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, the infrastructure tax credit applies to a range of alternative fuels. So hydrogen, biodiesel, ethanol. So politically, I'm no political expert, but when you think about the makeup of the next Congress, those fuel technologies matter for agricultural states and a lot of Republican members of Congress who are going to be in the majority. So again, there's a big question mark, but I feel much more comfortable that the 30C charging infrastructure tax credit is likely to stick around.
Yeah, fascinating. Obviously, the Inflation Reduction Act, Trump has, explicitly said that he wants to, chop that down. But like you said, all of these other incentives will likely remain. They probably would be a lot of work for him to wind down. And yeah, who knows? So
yeah, and just
like there still will be incentives to stack, right? Just maybe a few less.
Yeah. Yes, I do think that's the case. And let me just address that piece about the Inflation Reduction Act, which is so closely associated with the Biden administration. Despite the headlines, there's a lot of support in both parties in Congress for a number of the specific provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act. Just a couple months ago, 18 Republican members of the House of Representatives sent a letter to the Speaker arguing against wholesale repeal of the Inflation Reduction Act. And 14 of those Republican members are coming back to the House in the next Congress. And the Republican majority, the incoming majority, only has a margin of, I think, 5 or 6 votes. So I would be surprised if there's a wholesale repeal of the Inflation Reduction Act. And one of the reasons is because when you look at the billions of dollars of private sector investment that have gone to support clean energy and clean transportation manufacturing and assembly and jobs in the US, the top 10 states that have benefited from all of that investment incentivized by this Inflation Reduction Act, those top 10 states are all states that voted for Trump. So again, no one knows what'll happen after January 20th exactly when the new administration takes office, but I would be surprised if there's a wholesale repeal.
Yeah, certainly when we talk about, where EVs are made, a lot of southern states have, a lot of EV factories and stuff. So I could see that being hard to push through.
Yeah.
Republican Senate and House, right? Even if Trump wanted to.
Yeah.
Amanda, I haven't heard from you for a while, and I'm just interested to hear about how utility companies are thinking about this, right? If there is some sort of incentive repeal, are there other kind of state level incentives you think might take their place? Obviously, states, like Maryland are very keen on, electrification and green energy and all of that. So how do you think it's going to change things from a utility standpoint?
Yeah, so for Maryland, speaking about Maryland, Maryland has pretty aggressive goals when it comes to clean energy and transportation objectives. From my perspective, for our utility, we believe that's going to remain strong. As of right now, moving forward, BGE is actually putting together, actually all the utilities in Maryland are putting together our next phase of transportation electrification programs, which would include a composition of different make-ready incentives that would support additional charging infrastructure. So I would agree with Josh's comments in terms of we can expect changes. Any new administration that comes in, you can expect changes. But I do think, those 3 buckets that Josh talked about are really important to kind of keep in the back of your mind. While the federal level might change, the state levels probably won't change as much. And that utility level, that 3rd level Josh talked about, will still remain consistent. I know a lot of states kind of share Maryland's their goals for clean energy and just their objectives. And I think those are going to remain strong, at least what we're planning for the next 3 to 5 years. Those incentives will still be there to support customers that are looking to put infrastructure in place for charging.
I'm going to stay with you here for a minute because we got a question that is obviously for you. It's just asking, you said earlier 65,000 new EVs are coming online, right? Just what's the effect on the grid, right? And I think I'll add to that, is there how much more needs to be built out, right? Is this going to be a bottleneck at some point where grids are the thing, there's just not enough power, or do you think they'll be able to scale up efficiently with the EV charge?
We could probably spend hours talking about this. In Maryland, we're talking a lot about resource adequacy, which is at the forefront of every utility right now. What I would say, charging infrastructure is needed, right? So additional build out of the grid is going to be needed to support electrification goals, but it's also kind of 2 phases. We also need to manage that increase in electrification that's happening. So from a utility, and I can speak specifically about BGE, it's really important to have managed charging programs enabled for customers, both active and passive. So those are things that BGE is currently doing. We have a pretty large active managed charging program for customers, where customers enroll their electric vehicle, they earn a small incentive each month, and then we can actually manage when their customer vehicle actually charges, always guaranteeing that it has a full battery. But it kind of goes in parallel. There will be additional infrastructure needed, of course, to support electrification goals, but it's also managing that load that's impacting the grid as well.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. I'd love to continue this policy talk. I mean, there's certainly more than just incentives, right? I think a big piece of this is the financing. There's lots of new financing options. Some of them have a policy component, some of them don't. Maybe you guys can just talk a little bit about how, maybe the private sector might come in and provide more, policy, more financing options with some of their policy, and maybe like, what might be changing in that as far as like getting people access to cheap green financing for not only EV charging, right? This is also something that's coming for like electrification of buildings and all of the other things that are needed. Paul, let's go to you on this one.
Yeah. So, one thing that both myself and Switch offer is, you can either purchase the front or you can opt for a SaaS option. Similar to my turnkey solution is I'll either propose you the full cost of the installation and the chargers, or depending on the specific situation for the client, propose either a lease option or a finance option, depending on whatever term works best for the client. That kind of just allows, a little bit of more flexibility, being that these chargers and the actual infrastructure are a little bit costly. It's a heavy CapEx project for a multi-unit residential building. That kind of it lowers the barrier to entry, and it essentially provides that solution that at the end of the day, the resident, they need a charge, and they should be able to go down arcade, provide that, either in their own stall or in a transient array where it's first come, first serve. They're able to charge up, and that's just going to continue to grow the EV market. We've gotten to a spot now where there's been a lot of fleets that are swapping to EV. So I think we're pretty far into the EV adoption, being that not only the average resident or the average consumer has an EV, but these large scale businesses that run multi-million-dollar operations are also switching to EV. So I just think that it's obviously going to be a matter of time, and the utilities are doing the best they can, and these incentives are key, as I mentioned earlier.
Great. Josh, how about you? What do you think as far as the financing and making sure this is, attainable? And maybe we can open this up a little bit about, what are these upfront costs? I think there's still a lot of questions of, how much am I going to have to pay per EV charger? Obviously there's a lot of building specific things here, but maybe just talk a little bit about, the upfront cost versus maybe the revenue over time or the benefit over time, and maybe some of the financing options to help make those costs not as for a lot of properties that don't have a lot of capex right now, how do they get over that?
Sure. So kind of building on Paul's points, what Switch and Ani and Cap EV and other charging companies are doing more and more is offering a range of financing options to meet our customers' needs. And so some customers are in a position where they may have a budget next year for some capital improvements, and it makes good sense for them to look to pay upfront for not just the chargers, but the supporting electrical infrastructure, maybe panel upgrades, and take care of that through an upfront capital expense. Others may want to finance it, do a charging as a service model. So to your point, Franco, oftentimes, and Paul, I'm sure you can speak to this better than I can, and BGE has a lot of data on this as well in terms of how the costs break out. Often the infrastructure itself will be more costly than the charger, whether we're talking about a level 2 AC charger or a higher powered DC fast charger. But one thing it's important for customers, for property managers, property owners to be thinking about upfront is to plan ahead for what potential expansion might look like. And we see this with any number of upgrades, not just in the EV charging space, but let's say you manage a property with 50 units and you have, say, 4 households that want to install EV chargers. That number is going to grow. So even if you only make a PO right now for 4 chargers, be planning ahead. If you're looking at how much can the panel capacity handle, like be planning ahead, and to the extent it makes sense, it's likely going to be more cost effective to do some of those infrastructure upgrades up front and provide space to install more chargers later. And another key element of the cost effectiveness is the load management piece. Load meaning the electricity on the system. And so that is a solution that Switch specializes in. It's a more sophisticated approach to EV charging than just basically plugging into a wall receptacle, but it enables so much cost savings, both upfront because it can reduce the need for overbuilding the infrastructure, and it can also offer savings just by charging, by helping dynamically manage the charging so that vehicles charge, electricity may be cheaper, or vehicles stagger their charging in a way that avoids exceeding the capacity on the system. So to answer your question much more succinctly, the types of costs include the upfront infrastructure, the chargers themselves, the software and networking, and then a final piece is the ongoing operations and maintenance. And a lot of companies like Paul's company and Switch can bundle a lot of that for customers.
This is where I jump into
Yeah, go for it, Amanda.
for utility. So to Josh's point that he was kind of pointing out, this is where it'd be really important to start talking to your local utility. I know BGE, we have a service that we're proposing and hopefully gets approved by our Maryland Public Service Commission, but like advisory services. Right now it's new, right? Charging infrastructure is new for a lot of multifamily, publicly accessible buildings. So people don't have a lot of experience. But us, the utility, right? The infrastructure is the first piece that you need to actually have working chargers. We have a lot of experience when it comes to that. So start talking to us early and often. We can consult and provide you some feedback in terms of like the infrastructure that's currently available. Some utilities or states have local capacity maps that are available online that you can look up just to kind of see like what actual capacity is already there. If there's already existing capacity, it's going to lower your infrastructure cost that you have to occur. So just things like that. So the main takeaway for me is just talk to your local utility, reach out to us. We're happy to have a conversation. And then working with partners like Switch and others out there, they can also help give you that consultation piece to help you really understand what those total costs will be.
And Amanda, do you have any metrics about kind of what the turnaround time is, right? Between when someone says, hey, I want an EV charger, and when you can actually do it? Because that can be at least here in California where I am, that can be a huge bottleneck with utilities.
I wish I had a simple answer for you to say like X number of weeks or months, but it really depends. It really depends upon a couple of factors. One is their existing capacity. So if the transformer that would support your chargers has enough capacity, then that's going to decrease obviously the turnaround time for the build out. Permitting is a big factor. Weather impacts construction. We're getting into the rainy, wet seasons. It's going to make the construction timeline longer. I would say on a good day, if everything kind of goes the way there's capacity, we're only talking about a couple of chargers, maybe 6 months or so. But it really depends upon the EVSE equipment getting installed, and then again working with the local utility and the permitting and everything like that.
Yeah, definitely makes the case for talk to the utilities first. Kind of that's probably your first place you should go, right? Because
yeah, absolutely.
Getting them installed is easy enough, but yeah, getting the power to them is a lot harder.
Yeah.
We've touched on it a bit, but I want to jump into this impertinent question that we got that is basically kind of asking what is the advantage of using a turnkey solution like Ani or Switch versus just having an electrician come in and install these. I think we talked a little bit about the kind of the load management, but maybe you can get a little bit more into that and maintenance and all of that stuff. So yeah. Paul, I'll come to you next, Josh, but Paul, I'm interested to hear what you have for using a turnkey solution rather than just having one put in yourself.
Yeah, great question. A lot of the times turnkey solutions are misunderstood. When you specialize in a certain area, you're able to kind of learn from your failures and successes, and kind of provide different case studies to your clients and basically provide them with a solution that is best for that specific individual and that specific property. A lot of the times electrical contractors lack that experience. And so when is asking, you know, what would you recommend, or what have you seen in the industry, you know, they don't have that experience that they can rely on and provide some consulting experience. Yeah, so it would essentially encompass a full a walk first to identify, you know, what's the target area where you would want EV chargers. Do you want EV chargers in every single residential stall? BGE, I'm sure, would be able to accommodate, provided we put the request in. If there's only a request for transient chargers, or a few of the residents want EV chargers, I guess identifying the number of EV chargers and then going back to the utility, going back to the electrical room, identifying, all right, what do you have existing in your property? What can you pull from? If there's nothing, you got to make the request. And obviously, if there is no existing capacity, that's where the incentives come in, because when you're talking about a substation upgrade, a panel transformer, even for as few as 4 chargers, it's substantial. So in that case, we always recommend, to Josh's point, to future proof, right? So don't look at what the request is right now by the residents, future proof, and plan for 10, 15 years down the road. We know EVs are going to be here, so you might as well capitalize on the incentives that are here today, and install some additional provisions to allow you room to expand. So that's kind of, and then we would facilitate the rebate application and basically make sure that everything's commissioned and walk away. And we're there if there's any issues that go wrong, or to the operations and maintenance, we can set up a plan.
Yeah. So yeah, let me see if I understand. So it's the planning is a big part of it, right? Not
Yes.
just having someone, right? And then, you know, the ongoing operations as well, right? Like,
Yeah.
so this is not like having an electrician just drop, you know, drop
It's
these
not as simple as that.
and walk away.
Yeah. Yeah.
Josh, do you have anything maybe to add, another pitch for solution? And I'll throw in that I think there might be a little trepidation just because turnkey solar solutions, I think, oftentimes come with a lot of red tape and, you know, power leases and stuff that maybe have some negative opinions. Like, maybe talk to me about how it's different than kind of a turnkey solar solution.
Sure. I will say, so I'm not expert in the solar industry, particularly like residential rooftop solar. I will say that SEIA, the National Solar Energy Industries Association, recognizes that from a customer standpoint, that is a concern in the industry, that you have some kind of companies that are installers, and then customers end up getting a solar system installed, and then it may not be what they were expecting, or they may be caught in a longer financing situation than they were hoping for. That is a lesson learned of the solar industry, different than the EV charging industry. To build on Paul's point, one reason, and kind of, Franco, your original question to Paul, one reason why it's worth reaching out to charging companies in the market is because the EV charging industry itself is evolving. Companies are innovating, the product offerings are evolving and innovating and changing. And it's, to your point, it's not as simple as just running some electrical drops. EV charging, to charge an EV draws a lot of power. And so if you want to install half a dozen chargers, a dozen chargers, that's significant load on your system. And the ability to manage that is really key, as I mentioned earlier, to save money. And so let me, let's say someone watching this webinar is an electrical engineer and knows way more than I know about electricity. Despite that, I encourage you, talk to different providers, do some research, talk to the utility, particularly if your utility has an advisory service offering like Amanda was talking about. a lot of engineers, I love engineers, but in my experience, just to generalize, their personalities can be like, give me a problem, I'll sit down with my calculator and I'll figure out the solution, and here's the solution. And EV charging is not necessarily that simple. Um, Everything from the load management that we talked about to how will the software for a networked charging system integrate with other software. One of the uh, value propositions that Switch offers, particularly in the multifamily space, is that we have a lot of technology integrations with commercial real estate apps. So if you manage an apartment building and you already have a technology provider that helps your tenants schedule the laundry, we have some integrations with those technology providers so that they can have one app and schedule their laundry and schedule their charging all at the same time. And so if you are an electrical engineer and you problem solve this challenge, you may end up having the optimal solution for your situation, but do yourself and your fellow tenants and residents a favor and just reach out to companies who've done this, like Paul was saying, who have a lot of learnings from the field, and to utilities, who you should be talking to anyway at the start of this process to give them a heads up that you may be increasing the electricity load on the system.
Yeah,
So to jump in here real quick, Franco. So
Yeah.
BGE owns and operates about 400 chargers across our territory. It's a combination of publicly accessible chargers, so anybody could use them, whether you live in our state or you're going through a road trip, driving through the state. And then we also have chargers specifically installed at multifamily complexes to ensure that, we're meeting that equity adoption need, making sure it's accessible for all customers. I think like with this conversation, if you're someone that's interested and thinking about chargers, I think I would like guide you to think about what type of ownership do you want to have of these chargers, and then whether or not turnkey would be the right choice for you. If you're just looking to have these chargers additional amenity and you don't have the resources within your complex, like maybe you don't have a property manager that has the availability of time to take down the additional complaints from customers and things like that, turnkey probably might be the right way, especially if you have a turnkey solution that provides that operation and maintenance. Just makes it easy, less headache. You have a single number, your residents know who to call. But ultimately, it just comes down to like what type of ownership you're willing to invest and just have available. Ultimately, I think the way that we should be thinking about adding charging infrastructure to multifamily complexes should be thought about as an additional amenity for customers. Charging at home is the most convenient. It's flexible for customers, and there should be an opportunity, whether you're a multifamily customer or you're a single family resident, right? Have your own home, you should be able to have charging at home. So I think just to structure it as like thinking through additional amenities and like what's the best possible case to get that amenity into your community for customers.
Great point. Great point. I think, up until now, we have been talking mostly about kind of multifamily in a way, right? With this, putting this in these buildings and what's the business case. I think it's pretty obvious, right? You say people have EV, electric vehicles, they want to be able to charge at home, right? That's, I think, a bit of a no-brainer. I think there's still a little bit of, understanding of, can I charge more rent for this? Do I make additional, like you say, there are going to be, there's some additional headaches involved with this and money, right? Is this an amenity that now people like see and want to come to my house? I mean, from what you guys have seen, does this move the needle when it comes to, rent growth, revenue, any of those other kind of pieces to multifamily?
Yeah, for sure. Just to start on that question, 100% it does. I mean, even we touched on it earlier, Josh, if, for sure, if you were moving, you would look to see if that property had an EV charger so that you'd be able to efficiently charge your car every night, right? So it's definitely viewed as an amenity. And, you are able to charge a bit of a premium. We have a few properties where we have residential reserve chargers. The resident is able to reserve that specific stall with the charger so that they have it 24/7. We also have models where we have chargers that are within the residential visitor area, so that there's a bank of 4 or 8 chargers. It's a first come, first served basis, but it still provides the solution for the EV driver. they're able to charge their car. So yeah, it's certainly an amenity, and it's definitely something that people look at. You know, it's the easiest place to charge. You kind of forget about it. It's like charging your phone at night. So why not tackle that as a low-hanging fruit?
And I'll also say I can't speak to like to attract customers at multifamily complexes just because I don't own and operate a multifamily complex. But
Yeah.
the chargers that we own and operate on our public network, we are seeing utilization increase. So utilization definitely got off to a slow start. It's crazy to say, but the pandemic was 5 years ago. And as expected, people weren't driving very much. Even if you had an EV, like we weren't driving around. So utilization has been steadily increasing on our chargers. I mean, nationwide, I believe the utilization rate's around 15%. And we've actually seen our chargers get up to around 10% right now. So I think keep that in mind, like to the point, like I do think it does attract residents that have EVs to move into your building as long as they have access to EV charging. But we're also seeing our chargers utilization increase as well. So that whole conversation earlier about EV adoption, it's continuing, and the data's in the proof. What we're seeing in utilization is increasing on the chargers.
Yeah, just to add to that, if you compare our average residential site with our average commercial site, utilization and charging rate is definitely higher at the residential property. As I mentioned, it's the easiest place for them to charge. They don't have to go and look for a specific location on the PlugShare app for the commercial location, or say they're going to the mall or to the gym. You know, they don't necessarily need to plan their round chargers. So that's kind of adds to the amenity of the EV charger at the residential property.
Yeah, and that's a great transition to my next topic, which was, let's maybe talk about some different types of commercial buildings, right? Which might not have as specific of a reason to, get EV charging. I know retail is one. A lot of big retailers have hoped these chargers will, bring people in. I know you have to kind of sit there for a while, so there might be some foot traffic. Also office, right? Are there cases that you can make maybe where, an office can get a little higher lease or something, just because it has this and maybe the building next door doesn't. Josh, what's your opinion on that? Or go ahead, Paul, that's fine.
Just quickly, there's certain commercial tenants that are specifically requesting EV chargers. So yes, to answer your question, they're certainly looking, and they're looking at that EV charging box to tick off. And then just quickly at the commercial level, that's kind of an amenity to that specific tenant as well, or to the property. Say there's quite a few tenants that occupy space there, and the property manager wants to invest in some EV chargers to incentivize people to go to the mall, go to the gym, spend some time on the property, right? And so that's where we'd come in. We would walk the property with the property manager, identify locations. Where's the best possible location for us to put chargers so that when you come into the site, you see them right away. Obviously, that's not the most cost effective, but optically, it's the most ideal. And then obviously running through the situation on, costs associated and pairing them up with some rebates.
Yeah.
I'm smiling just because it might not be the most ideal. We've definitely had some conversations with customers about the spots that they choose, just because it's more costly. You have to run more wires basically for some of the locations. But I think it's that benefit cost analysis, right? Like, will it drive more utilization if it's more seen? Most likely. Commercial places, I'm kind of chuckling because I think for the first time ever in Maryland, I'm starting to see some lines at destination charging. Right before Thanksgiving, I actually snapped a picture of where there's these 8 chargers in a shopping center, and there, no joke, was probably a line of 6 EVs waiting because they were all the stalls were filled. So I think commercial charging or destination charging, while it's out there, I think there's more of a need for it, especially if you're sitting in a location, going shopping for 30, 40 an hour. It just becomes another amenity of why you would visit that shopping center.
Josh, how about you? Do you visit shopping centers while you charge? Like, what is it?
I do.
So it does have a material impact then.
100%. I mean, it can be a profit center in 2 respects. One is a direct profit center in terms of selling the kilowatt hours to the drivers, but there's also the indirect profit of the dwell time. While my car is charging, I'm going to likely be inside patronizing some of the establishments. My understanding of the traditional gas station model is that the margin on the fuel is actually maybe 1 or 2 or 3%. It's very small. But coming inside the convenience store, buying the coffee and the food is where they have much better margins. So yeah, and to Amanda's point about the lines we're starting to see at community or public or destination chargers, I mentioned at the top, just in the last quarter of this year, the previous quarter, the third quarter, over 350,000 pure battery electric vehicles were sold in one quarter. And that number is growing year over year over year. And those cars need places to charge. And not all of them have at-home charging. And so again, the fundamentals of the market remain strong. The need for charging, the demand for charging driven by this increased EV adoption is only going to continue to increase. And in your question, Franco, you asked like specifically about other multi-tenant property types beyond multifamily. Going back to this conversation around incentives, a lot of incentives, depending on the state, depending on the utility program, offer tailored incentives to different types of properties and often higher incentives for publicly accessible charging. So if you own a shopping center, if you own an office building where you want to install chargers in your parking lot that may serve employees but are also open to the public, there's a good chance there'll be incentives to help you drive down that cost.
So, Amanda, do we think that the public chargers are going to get to a point where we will no longer need the private ones, or is it going to lag a bit?
I think it's going to be a mixture will be needed to support the needs of electrification entirely for
just space-wise, right? I just don't think we have enough public parking lots to like.
Yeah, and I think it also just comes down to convenience. At the end of the day, charging at home is going to be the most convenient for customers.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, with the time we have left, I would love to look forward a little bit at some of the kind of, the next technologies that I think will be affecting this space. One that we have heard about for a while is like, bidirectional charging, which would mean that, at times at least, the buildings would be able to take power from these. It would basically act as a battery for buildings, which is also growing, right? Just standard building batteries are growing, but making the EV the battery in my mind seems like a great idea. Obviously, there's a lot of people don't love to know that their power was taken by their building or whatever, or their car's not charged. But what do y'all think about the future of kind of bidirectional and how that might affect the way that the charging infrastructure works? Amanda, I'll stay with you for a second on this one.
Yeah, that's a great question. So BGE is already thinking about that, and I think that's potentially the next step to kind of helping to manage that peak reduction is looking at having programs for customers that would incentivize them to provide us control of their vehicle and having them discharge their vehicle to charge their house, for example, and maybe one day back to the grid. I think that is the future. I think technology is slowly getting there. We need more cars and chargers that have that capability, and then obviously customers to be able to afford those types of cars and chargers. But I think it's important in terms of managing that resource adequacy concern that I talked about, is just having that be a component of moving forward for like a future utility program. And I should say BGE already has a small pilot. So we're currently doing it with a small amount of customers. We've actually had over the last summer, so from June to September, we actually had customers discharging their batteries to power their houses. That was a very
Is that part
small.
of
Go ahead, sorry.
That's part of the managed charging thing you were talking about earlier?
It was, yeah. So our managed charging program was, it was a Department of Energy backed demonstration. It was a small component of a demonstration that we did with the DOE. So very successful, great learnings, and we're hoping to kind of iterate it and start moving forward with some future programs in the next coming years.
Fascinating, cool. Josh, what's your thoughts on bidirectional charging and how it might kind of change the landscape?
Sure, I think near term, we're likely to see any bidirectional charging at scale with specific use cases, school buses being the most common example. Large batteries, they run fixed routes, and then they're sitting idle for a lot of the day. So for bidirectional charging to happen, you need a regulatory framework in place that enables the power going back to the building, and in some cases, the grid. You need the model availability for the vehicles. You need the charging infrastructure that can support it. And you also need an economic incentive for the driver or the vehicle operator. You kind of made the joke about people not being thrilled about, their power going back to the grid. In my experience, any bidirectional program I'm aware of is all voluntary. So it won't be this big brother sucking your power when you don't want it. You'll have the option. And just like a lot of smart thermostat programs for hot summer days, you'll be compensated for it. But I think kind of in terms of the future of EV charging and what's ahead, I think, bidirectional may grow in certain specific segments. But really, at a high level, I see the industry overall really improving when it comes to reliability of the charging stations. One of the lessons learned that the industry overall experienced in the early years, like going back 5-10 years, is the need to plan for and budget for operations and maintenance, particularly with public chargers that are out and exposed to the elements, and all different drivers are using them. Some may be more familiar, some may be less familiar. Things happen. And so two of the federal funding incentives I mentioned earlier, the NEVI formula program and the CFI grant program, both of those require a minimum of 97% uptime per port to be eligible for that funding. And what we're seeing around the industry is that that minimum standard has become kind of like a de facto standard for the industry. Amanda's nodding her head. A lot of utility programs have requirements for uptime, and a lot of the major charging providers have plans to provide that O&M. And so looking ahead, every year that new chargers are deployed and customers and site hosts are planning and budgeting for that operations and maintenance, I just see the customer charging experience overall just becoming much more consistently uniform and reliable.
Great. Paul, anything to add?
Yeah, just quickly, I think at a property level, it's a great idea because it essentially diversifies your energy, where you're pulling your energy from. You're not necessarily relying on utility and the respective peak charges that come with that. So you're just kind of allowing your it's great because it's evolving. It's similar to a building management system for HVAC control. Being able to use and charge, being able to control how you're powering up your building is important, right? Because you're able to pull from the EV chargers, or potentially pull from a solar component, or potentially pull from a battery storage option. Obviously, there's costs associated with each of those, but I think it's just good to see the industry trending in that direction.
Yeah, obviously, energy resilience is a huge piece of this, and that gives peak shaving. There's a lot that I could see benefits of that. So great. This is our hour that went by quickly. Thank you guys so much. This has been super interesting and hopefully insightful for all of you. If anybody would like to contact Paul, Josh, or Amanda, please send me an email. It's franco@propmodo.com. That's FRANCO @propmodo.com, and I'll happily connect you. I hope everybody has a great holiday and Happy New Year's, and we will be back next year with more of these webinars. Hopefully we will see more of you then. Josh, Paul, Amanda, thank you guys so much for joining.
Thanks, Franco.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you all.
Bye, everybody. Cheers.